Okay, guys, super excited. Melissa Shaver here. I've got Robin Sullivan who's with me, and we are partnering on this Enneagram Road Back to You book study. I'm so excited. So many of you guys are doing this with us, and so I'm thrilled. I'm hearing from many, many of you that are finding out what your numbers are, that are some of you are tearful and emotional around that. Others are a little bit fretful, trying to figure out, like, what does this mean? And it looks so negative. And we're going to be talking about some of those things. And then some of y'all are finding out and figuring out, like, I think that this is what my spouse is. I feel like that my children might be this. And that is the great thing about this, is that you learn not only about yourself and kind of getting yourself out of the box and some tools and some trigger points, but it also allows you to, like, look at the view of the people around you and how to love them well, kind of see what their tendencies are, how to work together. And so it's a really cool thing to be able to see. I know many of you are asking me, how can I dive deeper? What are some other resources, some other books? We'll put those out there. Lindsay might even have some things that she wants to add. There's some other pieces that Suzanne Stable has done. So we'll put those on our pages. So those are coming. But for now, I'm going to hand this over to a beautiful new friend. And this is what I love about Facebook. Lindsay and I have mutual friends that we both adore and love. And through this whole Road Back to You Enneagram book study, we kind of found each other in social media. And it has been just a true joy and blessing to get to know her, to hear her story. She is a writer, she's a reader, she's a lover of Enneagram. She has young children. She used to be a teacher. And when you hear her speak, you're going to see the teaching side come out. She's very compassionate with her words. I told her, if you guys have listened to Suzanne's podcast in any way, I love her voice because it's very calming, very soothing, has a lot of wisdom in it. And I really, whenever I listen to her speak, I think, okay, life is good. And I was telling Lindsay, that's how I feel about her, is that I feel like a lot of times that whenever we speak, I'm like, I feel like that you just have this beautiful, calming voice. So you're going to get to hear that tonight. But Lindsay, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is our wonderful women, and I'm going to hand it directly over to you so that you can get started and we can start listening and taking notes.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me kind of intrude on your group time. I'm so excited. I love nothing more than talking about the Enneagram. Mostly because it's been so transformational and so helpful for me and my personal growth and my relationships. And I really believe that it can change the world if we all are doing this work and becoming more compassionate for ourselves and for other people. So I'm going to do kind of a broad overview to start with. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I found the Enneagram, and then I'll go through stress and security and wings, and then we'll dive into the triads. Mm-hmm. So I found the Enneagram about 2 years ago, and it was kind of an interesting time for me. I have 2 daughters, and I was coming out of a period of struggling with some anxiety and postpartum depression for the second time. I had that with both daughters. And I just was sort of at a time where all of my normal coping mechanisms and ways of being in the world weren't working. And when that happens, it's a time when you're sort of open, you're kind of grasping and looking for something. And the Enneagram helped me understand what was happening and helped me make sense of that journey. So it's a really great tool. And it's particularly helpful when you get to those moments in your life where most of the time we're kind of on autopilot and kind of just reacting to things in our default mode. And when that stops working, it's a really painful sometimes, but really excellent opportunity for us to grow. So let's talk about the Enneagram is a tool. It is not the end-all be-all. It's best used along with other practices and other tools for personal growth as well as spiritual practices. It's especially helpful when used along with prayer or meditation or whatever practices you have that kind of help you to slow down and reflect. It comes from the idea that when we are children, because the world is broken, no matter how ideal and perfect your childhood is, no matter how loving your family is, the world is full of broken people and problems. And so our personality is, it comes from the things that we do to cope with the brokenness and the hard things in the world. And it is vital that we have that. It's important to us as children, and it serves us well. It serves a purpose. And the Enneagram kind of shows us our specific coping mechanisms. But then what happens as we grow and mature, when we get older, we find that those coping mechanisms may not be serving us well anymore. And so just like the book is called The Road Back to You, the Enneagram kind of takes us on a journey of uncovering who we were before we put on all of those extra strategies, and so that we can become more balanced. We don't want to get rid of anything. We're seeking balance. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the movement. The Enneagram's kind of different than other systems for personality because it's very dynamic. There's lots of movement. So your core number has obviously a number on either side of it. And those, you can kind of take on the flavor of one of those other numbers, but your core number is based on your motivation, and that does not change. So, for example, my number is a 6. I could take on a little bit of the 5 behaviors or a little bit of the 7 behaviors, but my motivation won't change. My motivation is still 6. And that's going to remain consistent with any movement you make on the Enneagram. Does not change your motivation or your core number. And so when you're considering what you think your number might be, it's more about motivation than behavior. Suzanne Stabile believes that for most of us, for the first half of life, we have one wing. And then as we grow and mature in the second half of life, we tend to add the other. And again, that shows kind of that balance piece. That's one way that we find balance. So it's helpful to think about when you were in your early 20s, because that's, when we are adults, but we haven't yet started to grow out of some of those coping mechanisms with maturity. So think about how you were in your early 20s. There is a caveat to that because we make movements in stress and security. If that period of time in your life was also a period of kind of
We can't hear you, Lindsay. We can't hear you.
Oh, uh-oh.
There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Uh-huh.
Okay. I don't know what happened. Okay. So I was just saying that when you think about if you're not sure yet what your number is, when you think about yourself in your early 20s, that's helpful if that were a period of prolonged significant stress or trauma, then you may identify more with your stress number during that time. So that's something to consider. So each number makes a movement towards another number in stress and then a different number in security. And again, just like the wings, you are not becoming that other number. Your core motivation is not changing. You're just taking some of those behaviors and those characteristics. And the idea is that it's not really, there's not judgment involved in that. It's not a bad thing. We, especially with our stress number, we take on things that we need to help us. And so, for example, kind of an easy example to look at is if your number is a 2 and you're a people pleaser and you love people and you're relationship oriented, you have a very hard time saying no, and you have a hard time with boundaries. But the movement to 8 in stress allows you to say no and set boundaries. But people with that personality, if they haven't done a lot of work, may have to get to a really stressed out, burned out, worn out place before they can start setting healthy boundaries. And the idea is that as we learn our stress number and as we become more aware, we can stop and make a choice rather than just reacting. And we can choose the positive characteristics from that stress number and not just react. Because when we're just reacting, our tendency is going to be to go to what we call the low side, the unhealthy part of that number. So the more aware we become, the more choice we can make rather than just reacting on autopilot. And then the movement to security, it's kind of interesting because even when we feel secure, we can still kind of go to the low side of that security number unless we've done some work. So like for me, I'm a 6 and my movement to security is to a 9. So a 6 is typically sort of anxious and planning ahead a lot and working really hard. And a 9 is more laid back and go with the flow, which is a really good thing. But if I'm not paying attention when I'm in security, I have no motivation and I don't get anything done. And so I have to be careful and be aware to go to the higher side, the healthier side of 9, where I can get things done, but without the anxiety that I typically have in my average space. Most of us, Suzanne says that most people, most of the time, are hanging out in that average to low average space. So if you meet somebody who says, I'm just a really healthy 6, that's probably not true. They may have done a lot of work and a lot of growth, but we have these tendencies. And even though we grow, we still, most of the time, we're not being hyper aware of what we're doing and we're kind of in that average space. So most of the teaching is to the average to low average space. One of the most important things about the Enneagram is that people have all different kinds of reactions when they figure out what their number is. Some people are, one number in particular, love their number and they're really proud. The rest of us might have a little bit of embarrassment or shame, or it can vary depending on your personality. But in order to really experience transformation and personal growth, it's really important that we learn self-observation that is compassionate and non-judgmental. Because the moment we start noticing ourselves with these habitual patterns of behavior that we haven't been aware of before or we haven't noticed before, our tendency is to try really, really, really hard not to do that anymore. And it doesn't work. And Suzanne Stabile talks about how willpower just actually gets us deeper into our personality and feeding our ego and trying really hard. And it might be a temporary change, but it's not a transformation. So transformation is much more likely to come when we become aware and we're honest with ourselves and we notice, but in a compassionate way, to the point where the goal is that eventually it's like, oh, look, I'm doing that thing again. Maybe I can make a different choice this time. And oh, I really made a bad choice that time. Isn't that interesting? I wonder why I did that. Next time, maybe I'll make a different choice. So we want to be more compassionate with ourselves and with other people in order to have growth. I'm going to pause there. Do we have any questions so far about wings or stress or security? I know that was kind of a broad overview before we go into the triads.
I just have a couple, and you guys might have one, but whenever you were saying that, like, if you're a 2, your wings are going to be a 1 or a 3, are you saying that you could sometimes have a 1 wing and sometimes have a 3 wing, or do you really just have one or the other?
So you tend to start out with 1 wing or the other, but as you get older, like, middle age and past that, as you mature, Suzanne says you typically start adding the other wing and have both. You have kind of access to both.
And that's really where you get a little bit more balanced. And if you really are good at self-awareness, then you can be healthy in that space to know how to kind of set your boundaries well and come back to a good spot.
Yes.
Okay.
So
I love that you said, whenever you said, when people say I'm a healthy 6, usually not, you're just average. Because I literally told Robin today, I think I'm a healthy 3. I think I'm pretty mature. And so I was waiting for her to text me and go, okay, you just got nailed. Because I'm like, okay, maybe I'm just average. So anyway, that was super fun. And then explain, if you don't mind, just a little bit more on when you were talking about trying to, in your early 20s, if you could kind of remember who you were whenever you're trying to find your number, and if it was a trauma period or a stress period, that might not be a good number. How would we find that number then? Because in my 20s was not a good time. So I know that I would have never found my number. And I know that other people are kind of like, I think I've been wearing a mask all of these years. So how can you help them understand how to really kind of find themselves in these numbers?
That's a great question. First, I would say that Suzanne often says, and I agree, that everybody should have a therapist. So a therapist can help tease out some of those issues in general. And I'm definitely not a therapist. But I would say, I guess I would say to think about times in your life that are sort of neutral. So, if you look across your whole life, times that were not particularly stressful times and maybe even secure times, and also to think about how you are at home as opposed to how you are at work. Because in most situations, we're going to have less of a mask at home than we do at work, unless you're in a bad situation at home. So I would try to think about periods of time and also environments where you feel like things are kind of neutral, it's not particularly stressful, and where you feel at ease being yourself.
This is Elnita. I have a question. So I feel like when I did the test, I came back as an Enneagram 1, but my 2 was really, really strong. And so initially when I was reading the book, I thought I was a 2, but I think life has helped me to push toward a 2 because I had to be a caregiver for a long period of time. And so, and I've been under a lot of stress. So do you stay stuck? Like, can you be, would you ever switch Enneagrams? I guess is what
the teaching is that your core number stays the same, but there is a lot of movement. So even though your core number is the same, you may be hanging out in that stress number for a prolonged period of time. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're asking?
I think it does, because like right now, I don't feel like I'm doing the things that like I used to do. And I was trying to figure out, why am I feeling like this, doing this? It doesn't feel like who I am. And I do know I'm a 1 because I did ask my therapist, and she said, you're definitely a 1 with a strong 2 wing.
Well, and the other thing I would say about 2s in particular, there are a few numbers on the Enneagram where gender really matters, and 2 is one of those. So culturally, we really like women to be like a 2. We want them to be helpers, self-sacrificing, relational, very warm and friendly. And so all of us as women have some of that. There's a good chance we have some of those learned behaviors because culturally that's what's expected of us and taught to us. And then for men, males are expected or respected when they're like an 8. We like the men to be strong and decisive and leaders and not a lot of vulnerability. And so that's kind of an interesting dynamic to consider as well. So when we have male 2s or female 8s, our culture doesn't always respond to them in a very accepting way. Sometimes they aren't perceived as being like a male 2, other men or the culture might perceive them as being too emotional or too relational. And female 8s are perceived as being too aggressive and too assertive, even though they're just displaying the same characteristics that we admire in men. So that's another interesting dynamic. And I've heard that with those numbers in particular, with male 4s and 2s and with female 8s, they tend to have a big wing that helps cover some of that to help them be a little more kind of culturally acceptable. So a male 2 might have a really big 3 wing to add in some of that, goal-oriented achievement, some of those things. I think if there's no other questions, I'll start doing triads. Anything else pressing before we move on?
I actually have a question for you, Lindsay. Hi, my name is Marquita.
Hi.
You mentioned motivation, not behavior, determine the number. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I have like a 2-part question. I want you to elaborate a little bit more on that. And when taking the surveys, how much weight should we really put on them? Because taking one survey, I scored really high as a 4, and I can relate to a 4, but I don't know if it's because of the season that I'm in. And then on one, I scored really high as a 3, and on both, there was 8 involved. I'm just confused.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to tell you that the tests are not very accurate. Very much of the time, they're not accurate. So you can take them as a starting place to kind of start thinking through things. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to determine motivation through a test because they tend to focus on behaviors. So when I talk about motivation versus behavior, an example would be if a house is burning down, all 9 numbers on the Enneagram are going to, I shouldn't say all of them, many of the numbers, many personalities are going to have negative feelings about that, and they're going to run out of the house and they're going to feel bad, but it's going to be for different reasons. So for me as a 6, I'm concerned with duty and responsibility, and I'm going to think, I can't believe it was my job to, do whatever it was, and I'm going to take responsibility for that. For a 4, 4s are in that shame triad. So 4s are going to think, I'm just a terrible person. How could this have happened? If I were a better person, this wouldn't have happened. For a 7, they might think, woo, this is so exciting and so fun. What a great story to tell my friends. So they're all going to be they may all be running out of the house and, have kind of an elevated emotional state, but it's going to be for different reasons. So we'll talk some. Do you have another part of the question? But we'll get more into it as we go in the triads. I'll talk some more about the motivations, but do you have another question, or was that your follow-up?
That was really my question. So I think that what I need to do is identify neutral situations. I think I heard you say that. Identify neutral situations and just ask the question, how would you respond? And then that could help me determine more motivational versus behavior. Thank you.
You're welcome. It can be tricky. Anything else? Someone's asking where to find the tests. There are lots of tests out there. I think there's an Ennea app. There's the Enneagram Institute. There's a lot of the tests you have to pay for. But again, I would just caution you to kind of take those with a grain of salt. I think the podcasts and workshops and books are super helpful. And they have, some of the podcasts will have a whole panel of several people that have the same number. And that's really helpful because you can kind of see different flavors of that number. So you may not identify with one particular person, but when you have several, that can be really helpful. Okay, I'm going to dive in and start talking about triads. So there are lots of different ways that the Enneagram numbers, the 9 numbers, are grouped into groups of 3 based on different common characteristics. And one of those ways is triads. So triads come from the idea that there are 3 centers of intelligence. There's thinking, feeling, and doing. And when we're born, we are born with all 3 of those things, and they're all perfectly in balance. But very soon, when we realize the world is not a perfect place, we start finding that one of those areas of intelligence serves us better than the other 2, and we develop a preference for the way that we take in information. So the triads are based on your preferred way for taking in information, whether you prefer taking in information with thinking, with feeling, or with doing. And it's going to be kind of intuitive thing that you're maybe not even aware of. But as you learn the Enneagram, you'll start to become more aware of it. And again, the goal is never to repress that and push it down. It's always going to be to bring up the thing that is lacking. And so every number has a dominant center, thinking, feeling, or doing, and then a repressed center, and then something that's kind of in the middle. So the triads are based on the numbers that have the same dominant center. So the first one that the book talks about is the doing, or the gut triad. It's also called the anger triad. So people in this triad tend to be, and this is not going to apply all the time for everything, these are just some general things. They're going to be more task-oriented. They take in information with doing. They walk into a room, the first thing they notice is what is being done, what needs to be done, what should be done. They tend to act before thinking. They're a little more impulsive at times, not always. They are trying to control themselves with logic and reason. They're very concerned about justice and power. They have a need to assign blame because their reputations are really important to them. So when something goes wrong, they're the ones that quickly want to find out who's responsible. They are not super flexible. They compare themselves to others, and they want to know, how do I measure up? They're intuitive, and they experience things just in a very bodily way. Things affect them physically. So that's going to include 8s, 9s, and 1s. It's called the anger triad because each of these, so each triad is going to be either anger, fear, or shame. And what that means, of course, we all experience all those emotions, but for whatever your number is, many other emotions quickly get converted into that main emotion. So if you're in the anger triad, lots of your feelings quickly turn into anger. And there may be other things underneath that, but anger is kind of the thing that is right below the surface a lot of the time. I think I'll go ahead and briefly talk about each number. Let's see, how are we doing on time? It's 8:30. Trying to decide, would y'all rather me go ahead and do an overview of the other 2 triads, or you want me to get into numbers while we're here? What do you think?
It looks like an overview of the triads. Is that everyone's shaking their head that way? So overview of the triads.
All right, so that's the gut, or the doing triad. The second one in the book is involves 2s, 3s, and 4s. They're the heart triad, which is also called the feeling triad or the shame triad. These people are going to be more relationship oriented, and their first instinct is to take in information with feeling. So when these people walk into a room, they're noticing feelings either on an individual level, they're noticing who's upset, who's had a bad day, or they may be reading the room in a more at a group level. They may be really good at walking into a room and kind of sensing the energy of the group. They easily, so right below the surface for them is going to be shame. And so they're relationship oriented, and they're image conscious, and they want to be liked. And so you could see how that would easily be tied to feeling ashamed if they're not meeting people's expectations. They hide their anger or other emotions with doing and kindness because they want to be, they're people pleasing, they want to be liked. And they give away their power in relation to what people want. And that's just kind of another way of talking about how they're going to adapt. They're going to adapt their behaviors or their the way they're coming across based on what they think that either you as an individual or maybe in a group context, what's wanted of them. Okay, so that's the feeling triad. The third one is the thinking triad or the head triad. It includes 5, 6, and 7. It's also called the fear triad. So people in this one are going to be more factually oriented. They like to take in information first with thinking. They have a strong need to understand things, to figure things out. They tend to overthink. They make a lot of plans. They are trying to hide their feelings. They try to sort of work things out in their minds. They're going to study people and kind of work things out in their heads before they take action. And their goal is to be objective. They're trying to get an objective view of the world. And then they're in the fear triad. So if you are relying on thinking a lot, that goes along with being fearful. So you're planning, you're trying to anticipate, you're trying to work things out in your head, and that goes along with fear. So many emotions in this triad get quickly translated into fear, and it shows up a little differently in each number, just like all the other ones. Okay, I think, so before we get into individual numbers, questions about any of the triads in general?
I just have a quick curious question just for futuristic if people are asking. I mean, whenever you talk through these triads, I think for some of us, we could say, okay, that's my triad, like that just described me. Is there a difference in learning your type first, then your triad? Or do some people learn their triad first and say, this is my triad, so I'm one of these numbers? Does it go one way or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can go either way. I'm not sure if we have time tonight or not. There's an interesting, so sometimes when people teach the Enneagram, they teach triads first and then narrow down. Sometimes they just go through all the numbers. So either way works. There's also, so triads are based on your dominant center. There's another grouping of threes called stances, which if you end up doing a lot of Enneagram work, stances are really, really helpful and important. And stances are just based on your repressed center. So what's interesting is, I'm not sure how to get this on my screen, but if you can kind of put the stances and triads in a grid, mm-hmm. and where they intersect also will show you your number. So if you can narrow down your stance and you can also narrow down your triad, that will point you to one number. So Suzanne Stabile has a 12-week video curriculum called the Enneagram Journey. And that's how they do it in that curriculum, is they have you, they teach triads and they teach stances, and then they find where they intersect.
Okay, outside of that 12-week study, is there any other way to figure out those stances?
I can tell you about them. I'll tell you about them briefly. She has workshops on them, and there are other Enneagram books that talk about them. Mm-hmm. I'll go through them briefly, and then we'll see how we're doing on time. So the stances are based on what is repressed, whether it's thinking, feeling, or doing. So first I'll list the numbers and what stance they're in, and then I'll talk a little bit about each one. So there's the aggressive stance, and that is 3, 7, and 8. And all three of those numbers are repressed feeling. And every one of these I say is going to sound terrible, and it's not terrible. It doesn't mean you don't have feelings, and it doesn't mean you don't think or that you don't do. So the dependent stance is 1s, 2s, and 6s. And those are all repressed thinking. I'm a 6. I feel like I'm reasonably intelligent. It's very hard to say I'm repressed thinking, but it doesn't mean that you're not smart. We'll talk about it in a minute. And then the withdrawn stance is 4s, 5s, and 9s. So the aggressive stance, being repressed feeling, means that you each number in that stance deals with it different ways, but that you don't always use feelings to make decisions or pay attention to either your feelings or other people's feelings when you're deciding what to do. So, for example, an 8 would likely be not super aware of how their actions are impacting other people. They're not trying to hurt people's feelings, but they're just not really thinking about it. And then a 7, they're feeling repressed because they like to be in, if you have this range of emotion, and this is really, really happy, and this is really, really depressed, 7s only go to here. They do not want to hang out in the negative emotions. So when they get there, they try to bounce back as quickly as possible. And so they don't, they hang out in the positive emotions as much as possible until they've done some work. And then 3s are, they are noticing feelings, but not very in touch with their own, and not always using that information. When they notice feelings, they're not always using that information to make a decision about what they're going to do. 3s are very goal oriented, and so feelings sometimes feel like it's too inefficient to get bogged down in all of that. We need to move forward. So 3s set feelings aside. So that's the aggressive stance. The dependent stance, 1s, 2s, and 6s, are repressed thinking. It doesn't mean that they're not thinking. It just means that they're not thinking productively a lot of the time. So like for me, for 6s, our hallmark is kind of that we are worst case scenario planners. So we are fearful. We feel like the world has a lot of danger and bad things happen. And the way we deal with that is by trying to anticipate all the bad things that can happen and be ready. We want to be prepared. And when we are doing all of that planning and preparing for things that may never happen, that's not productive thinking. And so until we do some work, or when we're in a more secure place, we're spending a lot of time thinking, it's kind of spinning our wheels, thinking about things that aren't going to be helpful. 2s are repressed thinking because they think a lot, but Suzanne's a 2, and she says that, I forget what percentage she says, like 80 or 90% of what she thinks about is relationships. And she says, as it turns out, there are other things to think about besides relationships. So 2s, until they've done some work, will tend to be thinking all about people and feelings and relationships, and they're not thinking about other things. And then 1s have a relentless inner critic. It's almost like a voice in their heads that is constantly criticizing, correcting, shaming, talking about all the things that they've done wrong, that they should have done differently, all of those things. And so a lot of their thinking is kind of these conversations with this inner critic, and that is not productive thinking. So those are the reasons that each of those numbers are thinking repressed. And then the withdrawing stance, which is 4s, 5s, and 9s, they're doing repressed. And again, it does not mean that they're not doing things. It just means that they're not always doing things productively. So 9s are even in the doing triad. They notice what needs to be done, but they have a really hard time prioritizing. So like with a 9, if you give them a list of all the things that need to be done in a day, brushing your teeth, paying the mortgage, going to work, picking up your kids, making dinner, every task, if you put those on index cards in front of them, all of those look the same to them. They can't prioritize what's important. They just kind of do what's in front of them. So they're very busy people, but they get sort of sidetracked and they kind of meander, and they do whatever happens to fall in front of them. So that's not productive doing. 5s are in the withdrawing stance because they live very much in their heads, and they make lots and lots of plans, and they have wonderful ideas, and they'll do a whole lot of research and make big elaborate plans for what they want to do, and a lot of the times they don't ever actually end up doing the thing. By the time they've finished all that planning, they're kind of done with it and they don't have the energy to do it. And then fours. Fours are creative, artistic, complex people, and they have a very rich imagination and kind of a fantasy world that they're crafting in their minds. And they don't like to do everyday ordinary tasks. So they're doing repressed because they're not very good at attending to the everyday, boring, ordinary tasks that need to be done. They might rather be writing a song instead of cooking dinner or doing the laundry. So that's why they're doing repressed. So as you get deeper into Enneagram work, once you know your number and your stance especially, a lot of the work is around bringing up that repressed center. So what does it mean for me as a 6 to bring up thinking? It looks like finding ways to get out of that loop of worst case scenario planning. Or for ones, bringing up thinking would be finding ways to talk back to that inner critic so that you can move on to more productive thinking. So there's a lot of work around stances. And like I said, if you find your triad and your stance, those will intersect with one number. So that's another way to narrow it down if you're having trouble. Any questions about stances? Okay.
Got about 8 minutes, Lindsay.
All right. I think, trying to decide the best way to do this. I'm going to go really quickly through each number just to do an overview, and then we'll see if there's questions after that. Okay, so 8s are the most energetic number or personality on the Enneagram. They trust themselves very much. They have a really hard time trusting other people. They have a fear of being betrayed. They're energized by conflict, and they like to be met with energy. They're very intuitive, very decisive. They are very comfortable being a leader. 9s are almost the opposite, which is why like a 9 with an 8 wing is a really complicated thing because they're two opposites. 9s avoid conflict. They have a need to avoid conflict. They are peacemakers. They see all sides of a situation, all perspectives, all points of view. It's not black and white for them. Everything is gray. And it's wonderful, and it's also frustrating, which for all of these things, the good thing is also the bad thing. They have the least amount of energy on the Enneagram because they are internally and externally boundaried, which means they are trying to keep out anything that's going to disrupt their inner peace. And they're trying to keep in anything that they might say or do that would disrupt the peace out here for everybody else. So they're trying to keep the peace internally and externally, and that is exhausting. And so they have the least amount of energy. 1s are the perfectionists. They have, like I talked about earlier, that relentless inner critic. That's kind of the hallmark for 1s. If you don't have that, you are not a 1, but some people are so used to it, they don't recognize it at first. So that's something to pay attention to. They are black and white thinkers. They think there is a right and a wrong way to do things. And a lot of times they think they know what the right way is, and they want to help you by helping you know the right way to do things. They get frustrated by the fact that other people don't seem to care as much as they do about doing things correctly or the right way. They're rule followers. They have a need to be good, and they pursue excellence. They have a lot of shoulds. 2s are relationship oriented. They kind of, the main thing about 2s is their superpower is that they can sense people's needs without even trying. They, without you even saying anything, they know how you're doing, what you need, and how to help you. They like to give advice. They like to help people. They are not very in touch with their own needs or feelings. They have a lot of feelings, but the feelings they have are usually other people's feelings. So it's very difficult for them to get alone and get quiet and figure out which of these feelings is really mine and not just me being empathetic for other people. They have trouble asking for what they need. They don't want to be perceived as having any needs. They would just want to help everybody else. 3s are goal and success oriented. They love setting goals. They love cheering on other people and helping other people be successful. They are intuitive. 2s are intuitive in reading individual people. 3s are intuitive at reading a room or a group of people. 3s, when they are in a group of people, can quickly, almost without even thinking, they know what is required to fit into that group, and they know how to be that for that group. They know how to change the way they're dressed or the way they're speaking, or make these little changes to fit into a group really well. They're very energetic and optimistic, and like I said earlier, they kind of set feelings aside. Efficiency is very important to them, and sometimes feelings seem like there's not time for that, so they kind of set those aside, including their own feelings. 4s are, like I said, very creative, very relationship oriented. They have a swing of emotions. What the rest of us might experience in a month, emotionally, a 4 can experience in an hour. They go from being happy to sad to angry to excited to anxious very, very quickly, and then back again. So they have this constant swing of emotions, and they're trying to manage that all the time. They feel like there is something missing in themselves that everybody else has, and they really struggle with, on one hand, they want to be unique and special and complicated and interesting, but they're also sort of envious of the fact that other people seem to fit in so easily and they don't. They feel misunderstood. They're the most complex number on the Enneagram. They notice what's missing a lot of times, and they do this push-pull thing in relationships where they have a fear of abandonment, and so they'll get kind of really, really close and clinging to someone, and then they realize how scary it would be if that person would leave me. Of course, they couldn't love me for who I am, and so then they kind of push away and back off to protect themselves in the event that they would be abandoned. And then they think, oh, maybe I've pushed too far, so then they pull back in, and there's this constant back and forth push and pull. 5s are sort of opposite that. They're the most emotionally detached. They can have a feeling and then let it go pretty quickly. They value being objective. They're the only number on the Enneagram that can be truly neutral. They have a need to be independent. They have a measured amount of energy, and so every day they wake up with this much energy, and every social interaction, every task makes that energy level come down. And so every day they're trying to manage this limited amount of energy. So they need a lot of alone time and time to kind of recoup that energy. 6s are called the loyalist. They are, like I talked about, kind of the defining characteristic of the 6 is the worst case scenario planning. So they're fearful. They believe the world is full of danger or problems, and so they want to protect themselves and the people they love by anticipating all of those things and being ready. They always have a backup plan for their backup plan. They're very loyal. They believe that there is safety in numbers and in groups. And so they like doing things in groups. They're very concerned about the common good. They think when we help everybody, that's the best way to help me and everyone else. They're rule followers. They have difficulty trusting themselves. That's the other important thing. They have a lot of self-doubt. They have difficulty trusting themselves, which makes it also difficult to trust other people. They tend to be a bit skeptical. But once you win them over, they're kind of with you for the long haul. And then 7s are, like I talked about before, they like to be in that happy half range of emotion. They like to be everything. They're very positive, very energetic, very upbeat. They love to try everything. They love to try all kinds of experiences. They're always looking for the next great, fun, exciting thing to do. They need a lot of freedom and independence. They have trouble following through. They start something and then get kind of bored and want to move on to something else. They're very charming and they're quick thinkers. And they do not like expectations. So that was a really, really quick rundown of all of those. What questions do you all have?
I have a question. So is it possible to be, see, I've been going back and forth between whether I'm a 9 or a 4, and I feel like I might be a 4, but maybe have like a 9 wing. Is that possible? Because they're not in the same triad. I don't know if that's a thing. I just feel like when I was reading the book, I haven't finished it yet, the 5, 6, 7, but I definitely resonate more with the 4 and the 9. So I don't know if that's possible to have a wing that's outside of the triad.
That's a good question. So your wing is always going to be one of the numbers right next to your number. But 4s and 9s are both in the withdrawing stance, and so they're going to have a lot of overlap. So that's probably why you're having difficulty deciding. I'm trying to think. I would say that 4 is going to be, is going to have that swing of emotions, whereas a 9 is going to be much more steady and even keel. And 9s are working really, really hard to just kind of be go with the flow. And whereas 4s don't want to go with the flow. They want to be unique and they want to be authentically who they are.
Yeah, so I think I'm probably a 4, but I don't know what, but you can still resonate with the 9 and not have it really be any, like, I think that's where my confusion is.
That
I feel like maybe that's my stress number, because a lot of the stress number of the 9 was a lot of the things that I resonated with, I think. So maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, and you know, all of us can have, all of these things overlap some, and we all, they talk about, like, everyone has energy from all of the numbers. So your number is just kind of the one that is dominant with all of them.
Good.
I know, Laura, I think you had a question like between 2 and 8, right? That's where you were kind of.
No, it's 3 and 8.
3 and 8.
Yeah,
Yes.
I now I'm more confused than ever, and I absolutely have no idea. No idea.
So 3 and 8 would be a really common one to they have a lot of similarities. So they're both in the aggressive stance. They're both doers. They're both getting stuff done. And 8 is going to have a real big issue around trust. 8s trust themselves very much, and they do not trust other people easily. So they're going to be a little more private. They're not going to be as concerned with connecting with people. They're more concerned with moving ahead and getting stuff done and solving problems. A 3 is going to be more concerned with, 3s are going to notice kind of when they walk into a room, they're going to be very conscious of the energy of the room and reading the room and trying to see where they fit into that. Whereas an 8 is kind of doing their thing and not even noticing that.
The thing that confused me about 3s, though, is that it says that it's not really in touch with their feelings that much. Yeah, that doesn't match at all for me. I'm like feeling always. I know what I'm feeling stuff all the time, a lot of emotion, and I know what it is that I'm having. So I don't know that's where I get hung up. I'm just still hung up on it. Sorry.
Maybe when you read 5, 6, 7, that'll help.
Okay.
So hang in there.
Okay.
And also, if you or anybody, 6s in general tend to not know what they are until they read every single number And that's so like in the Know Your Number workshop she saves the 6 for last because she knows that we will never land on a number until we've heard them all. So you may just need to hear all of them before you land somewhere.
That's what I'm going to just stick with. Learn it all. Learn it all. Any other questions? I know that some people need to jump off. I know Lindsay's given us a ton of time. You're getting lots of hearts and loves, and everyone wants to become an Enneagram coach, I do believe. So thank you, thank you, thank you. This was so wonderful, and I love how you just made it concise for us to keep chewing on as we finish out the rest of the book. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate just you being selfless and saying, hey, I would love to help you out. We could have never done what you just did. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I absolutely love it, and I'm excited for y'all to be on this journey.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you.
You guys have a good
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.